The document under examination presents a systems-level argument about contemporary US-Iran tensions, contending that what appears on the surface to be a bilateral confrontation is in fact a deeply interlocked geopolitical structure involving Chinese energy interests, global oil markets, and Pakistan's underappreciated role as a diplomatic connector. The analytical framework offered is broadly sound and reflects established thinking in complexity theory as applied to international relations. However, the text also carries notable rhetorical tendencies that deserve scholarly scrutiny. This analysis will contextualize the argument historically, assess its key claims across political, economic, and humanitarian dimensions, evaluate its sourcing and framing, and offer a forward-looking outlook grounded in evidence rather than speculation. The core intellectual contribution of this document is its insistence on moving beyond event-driven analysis towards structural analysis, what scholars like Kenneth Waltz would call the difference between first image and third image explanations of international conflict. This is a genuinely important methodological point. US-Iran tensions did not emerge in a vacuum. They are the product of decades of accumulated grievance, strategic miscalculation, and systemic entanglement beginning at least as far back as the 1953 CIA-assisted coup that removed Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, running through the 1979 revolution, the Iran-Iraq War, in which the US backed Saddam Hussein, and the cyclical collapse and partial revival of nuclear diplomacy from the JCPOA signing in 2015 to its abandonment in 2018. What makes the current moment structurally different from earlier episodes of tension is precisely what the document identifies, though it does not name it explicitly: the phenomenon of multipolarity under economic interdependence. During the Cold War, the US could apply pressure on Iran with relatively containable consequences because the international economic system was less integrated and China was not yet a major stakeholder in Middle Eastern energy. That structural reality has changed fundamentally since the early 2000s. Today, any military action near the Strait of Hormuz sends immediate signals through oil futures markets in London, Chicago, and Shanghai simultaneously. The document is correct to foreground this, even if it somewhat overstates the novelty. At the local level, Iranian domestic politics cannot be separated from its foreign posture. The hardline establishment in Tehran has historically used external pressure as a mechanism for internal consolidation. Sanctions and military threats do not simply weaken regimes, as decades of empirical evidence from Cuba, North Korea, and Iraq demonstrate. They often strengthen nationalist narratives and reduce the political space available to reformist or moderate factions. This is a crucial dimension the document largely omits. At the regional level, the document correctly notes Iran's asymmetric strategy, but does not fully account for the role of Iran's regional proxy network, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, various militia structures in Iraq and Syria, which constitutes what analysts call the axis of resistance. This network is Iran's primary instrument for imposing costs on adversaries without direct confrontation, and any serious analysis of US-Iran dynamics must account for it as a variable. At the global level, the document's framing of China as a strategic beneficiary of US distraction is well supported by observable behavior. China's engagements in the South China Sea, its Belt and Road infrastructure investments across Central Asia, and its accelerated military modernization have all proceeded with greater ease during periods when Washington's attention has been concentrated elsewhere, Iraq post-2003 being the clearest historical example. Economic consequences. The Strait of Hormuz argument is the document's strongest empirical claim and deserves to be treated with precision. Approximately 20 to 21% of global petroleum liquids transited through the strait as of recent years, according to the US Energy Information Administration. For Asian economies, Japan, South Korea, India, and China, The dependency is even more acute, with some estimates placing China's Hormuz-linked oil exposure at roughly 40% of its total crude imports. This creates what economists call a collective action problem. No major economy benefits from closure, yet the threat of closure can be used as leverage by a party willing to impose costs on everyone, including itself. The long-term economic consequence the document hints at, but does not develop fully, is the accelerating incentive for energy diversification. Every period of Hormuz instability strengthens the business case for renewable energy investment, alternative shipping routes, and strategic petroleum reserves. In this sense, Iranian leverage is structurally self-limiting over a generational timeframe. Social and humanitarian impact. This is the document's most significant blind spot. The text is written entirely from the perspective of state actors and strategic systems. The human cost of this geopolitical maneuvering. Iranian civilians living under sanctions-induced economic collapse. The approximately 25 million people in Yemen affected by the conflict, in which Iranian-backed and Saudi-backed forces are proxies, receives no attention whatsoever. This is not simply an oversight. It is a framing choice that systematically excludes the most vulnerable populations from the analysis. A complete account of this system must reckon with the fact that calculated restraint at the elite level is often experienced as catastrophic instability at the civilian level. The document identifies 4 primary actors, and its characterization of each is broadly reasonable but benefits from sharpening. The United States is correctly described as operating with constrained options, though the document underweights the role of domestic political cycles. U.S. foreign policy posture toward Iran has historically swung dramatically between administrations, making long-term systemic strategy more difficult to sustain than the document implies. Iran is accurately characterized as pursuing asymmetric complexity, but the document does not distinguish between the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which drives the confrontational posture, and the formal diplomatic establishment, which has repeatedly shown willingness to negotiate. These are not unified actors. China is described, with appropriate nuance, as preferring stability while quietly benefiting from U.S. distraction. What the document underemphasizes is China's growing direct diplomatic role in the region. Its brokering of the 2023 Saudi-Iran Normalization Agreement being the most important recent example of Beijing stepping out of the background and into an active mediating role. Pakistan presents the most intellectually interesting case. The document's argument about Pakistan's value as a connector state is structurally sound and reflects a well-established concept in diplomatic theory, sometimes called bridge diplomacy or pivotal state theory. Pakistan's relationship with Iran is shaped partly by the significant Shia Muslim population within Pakistan, its shared border, and its economic interdependence. Its relationship with China through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor represents one of Beijing's most significant Belt and Road investments. And its relationship with the United States, while historically turbulent, remains institutionally functional. The document is right that this triangular connectivity gives Pakistan a role disproportionate to its conventional power. However, one must also note that Pakistan's domestic instability, political, economic, and security-related, significantly constrains its capacity to exercise that role consistently. This document warrants careful, critical evaluation. It is written in the style of long-form analytical commentary, likely produced for digital video narration, given its rhetorical pacing, its use of direct address, and its structural reliance on building suspense through delayed revelation. The repeated use of phrases like, "but here is where it gets interesting," and this is where the entire equation shifts, are rhetorical devices characteristic of content optimized for audience retention rather than academic rigor. The text does not cite a single source. There are no statistics with attribution, no named analysts, no reference reports. Claims about the Strait of Hormuz, China's energy dependency, and Pakistan's diplomatic contacts are presented as self-evident without evidential grounding. For a scholarly audience, this is a serious limitation. The framing also carries a detectable ideological lean. The United States is portrayed with notable sympathy. Its restraint is described as discipline and calculation rather than, say, legal constraint, public opinion pressure, or military overextension. Iran is portrayed primarily through the lens of strategy rather than sovereignty or grievance. Pakistani agency is invoked but not deeply examined. Chinese motivations are framed purely in terms of interest calculation, with no acknowledgement of its own internal pressures or the perspectives of smaller states that experience Chinese strategic behavior as coercive. The missing voices are substantial. Iranian civilians, Yemeni populations, smaller Gulf states, Indian strategic interests, and the perspectives of international legal institutions are entirely absent. The systems-level dynamic described in this document has meaningful historical precedents. The most instructive is the Concert of Europe following the Napoleonic Wars, where major powers developed informal systems of managed competition specifically to avoid the catastrophic consequences of uncontrolled escalation. The stability of that system lasted roughly 4 decades before breaking down. Instructively, not because any single power sought total war, but because the system's internal tensions accumulated to a point where a relatively minor trigger, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand in 1914, in the later iteration of that logic, produced consequences no actor had intended or could control. A more recent parallel is the Cold War period of détente in the 1970s, when the United States and Soviet Union, despite fundamental ideological opposition, developed mechanisms, the hotline, arms control treaties, back-channel diplomacy, specifically designed to reduce the risk of miscalculation in a system both sides recognized as dangerously fragile. The document's argument about Pakistan's role as a communication channel fits precisely within this historical logic of reducing escalation risk through indirect contact. Scenario 1. Manage tension with partial diplomatic opening, most likely. The current pattern of pressure and restraint continues, with neither side seeking decisive escalation. Economic pressure on Iran intensifies, but Tehran manages this through selective engagement with Asian partners, particularly China and India. Pakistan facilitates quiet back-channel contact. A limited, informal understanding, not a formal agreement, reduces the immediate risk of military incidents. This is the most structurally stable scenario and aligns with the current behavioral patterns of all major actors. Scenario 2. Accidental escalation through miscalculation, moderately likely. A tactical incident, a naval confrontation in the Gulf, a proxy attack attributed to Iran, a miscommunicated military signal, triggers a response cycle that moves faster than diplomatic channels can manage. This is historically the most common pathway to conflicts that no party originally wanted. The document is correct that this risk is real, and it is the scenario that justifies the entire argument about Pakistan's connector role. Scenario 3. Structural realignment driven by energy transition, long-term. Over a 10 to 20-year horizon, accelerating decarbonization in major economies progressively erodes the strategic centrality of the Strait of Hormuz. As the leverage point diminishes, the entire geopolitical architecture described in this document shifts. Iran's geographic advantage weakens. The urgency of Gulf stability decreases for China. The calculus of US engagement changes. This scenario does not resolve current tensions, but it does suggest that the present system is operating within a structural timeframe that is finite. What makes this document significant is not its originality. Systems thinking in international relations has a long scholarly lineage, from Waltz to Rosenau to the complexity theorists of the 1990s. What makes it significant is that it is attempting to transmit genuinely sophisticated analytical frameworks to a mass audience, and largely succeeding in that pedagogical mission. The instinct to ask, what is the structure behind the event is exactly the habit of mind that good citizenship in a complex world requires. My reservation is this: systems thinking, when applied without ethical grounding, can inadvertently aestheticize power, turning the suffering of millions into an elegant intellectual puzzle. The most important question this document never asks is not who controls the system, but who pays the price when the system fails. That question should never be secondary. It should be the point from which all analysis begins.